Today we have a professor from Texas, so Cheryl Dowie.
I'm currently in University of Houston downtown.
We will be talking about negotiations in groups, which is a very relevant topic to the ex-culture students who work in groups.
Thank you. Thank you, Vas. So good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are based. Thank you for having me here today. I'm very excited to be here to speak to all of you about this topic, negotiating in groups. This is an area I'm passionate about, and I hope to share some insights that will be both informative and interesting for you. And before we dive in, let me share a little background about myself. So I completed my education, my master's, my PhD at Manchester Business School, and I worked as an academic in Aberdeen, Scotland for about 4 years before moving to Houston, Texas last year. And prior to pursuing a career in academia, I worked as a financial analyst at Hewlett Packard, and then I moved on to the transitions mobilization team, and that would mean project management at IBM and Accenture, working for clients like AOM, ICI Paints, Thomas Cook, DHL, and Home Depot. And I can say these experiences exposed me to negotiating, right? Business negotiations. And this sparked a deep interest that I further explored during my PhD studies. So let's move on. Today, the agenda we have is I'll provide an overview of business negotiations, to gain, and then we understand what positional bargaining and interest-based negotiations is about. Then I also provide an overview on conflict management styles. And then we try to understand more about the variables that can influence negotiation outcomes. And then, I'll share some key concepts that can be applied in real life negotiations. So, so a raise of hands, I'm just going to try to monitor the chat. Do you think everyone can negotiate?
Can or can well negotiate?
Can negotiate and can negotiate well.
Yes, I guess we all negotiate, but how well, that I doubt.
Yeah, so there's nothing in the chat, so I don't know how to
I
monitor
think we need to
anything.
go to the Q&A, so it looks like the chat is disabled and I'm trying to enable it from the phone. So
So the oldest comments come at the top, is it? Yeah,
trying to
okay, so I
see. Yeah.
see.
Mhm.
So everyone can negotiate, even sometimes not well, not so convincing. Yes, that's right. Um, yeah, and I think chat is disabled for some. All right. On that note, let me just, so what I'd like to say is, you know, yes, everyone can negotiate. Life is filled with human interaction. You interact with your friends, your family, your employers, employees, business associates, merchants, etc. And this human interaction is essentially a negotiating arena. You communicate during these interactions and you use the information and knowledge that you get from there to get what you want. And so you can say that negotiations, to an extent, is the process of influencing others to get what you want. And in life, what seems to be interesting to notice is we seem to be able to readily negotiate with our friends about where to go, what movie to watch, where to have dinner, and so on. And even with our respective spouses, partners, we are able to negotiate on budget time, childcare needs, and so on, right? However, when it comes to business negotiations or negotiating in a group setting in a business environment, we seem to be a little reluctant. So, can anybody tell me why this is the case? I'm just going to look for answers in the chat again. So, yeah, we don't do them well. That's good. Thanks, Enrica. And yeah, so it could also be that we are not interested. Let We're not as interested to do it, and some of us may dread what the outcome would be because it's not aligned with our expectations, or we simply just don't know the person we're negotiating with well enough, right? But given that negotiating with, employers, employees, business associates, people with work, business negotiations is basically an inevitable task. Um, and the stakes in business negotiations are high than other type of negotiations, so it would be wise to prepare well for it. So that's what I'm going to help you with a little bit. And, at the end of this session, I don't expect you to be professional or expert negotiators, but we'll just try to help you understand what you're doing right and wrong in the negotiations and reflect on your negotiation styles. So can anybody type out for me in the chat, how would you define negotiations? I'm looking at the questions again. Bargaining mutual needs, good. Win-win for both parties. Yes, we would like that. Conversation of both parties to make one final decision that make both parties agree and happy. Understanding the expectation of other parties, processing of getting what you want from others, how well you can tackle questions. Very good answers. Thank you so much for all these. This is very interesting. So what I'm going to show you in the next slide is some definitions of negotiations which have been proposed by scholars. So Carnival and Pree says negotiations is a process where parties come together to resolve perceived incompatible goals. And Lax and Sibinius, they say it's an interactive process by which two or more people seek jointly and cooperatively to do better than they could otherwise. And Gori says it's a voluntary process where two or more parties come together after modifying their offers and expectations. So from all of these definitions, what do you pick out? What can you pick out from these definitions? Does anything stand out which is similar? I'm looking at the chat again. What seems to scream out to you and from these definitions? Mutual agreement, yes. Interaction between two people coming together, very good. Yes, voluntary process. Requires cooperation, offering and acceptance, yes. Yes, very good answers again. So yes, from these definitions, you could also say that negotiations requires interpersonal skills. For example, your counterpart needs to like you, they need to respect you, and trust is gained through this respect. So one way I can think of this is to be clear in your communication. Do not ask for things without providing a reason as to why you want it, right? And secondly, active listening skills are important in negotiations. You can get a lot of information from just listening. And during negotiations, it's also important to keep your emotions in check. And from these definitions, it's also worth noting that negotiations it's not a game. It is not about using power tactics like shouting over the other person or bullying another. Likewise, it's also not about chiseling, intimidation, or trickery. With practice and experience, of course, you can understand how to negotiate better. There's no one rule that fits all in negotiations because it is a complex process. And it is complex because it involves human beings who have different aims and intentions, different way of doing things, perceiving things, because we all come from different backgrounds. So moving on to, is everything negotiable? What do you think? I'm looking at the chat again.
So students, please use Q&A for the communication. For some reason, chat, it doesn't look like it works for everyone. So not clear why, but I hope that Q&A window just works for the same purpose. And I see some people are saying that, yes, everything's negotiable, and others are saying no.
Yes,
and then
that's
some
right.
people say sometimes.
So good points. So So not everything is negotiable and not everything should be negotiated. For example, would you sell your child or your pet or compromise on the health of these? You know, while negotiations require a minimum of two people, your counterpart is likely to hold some things that are not negotiable. And it is important to sort of evaluate your negotiation options considering your moral codes, personal ethics, and values, and so on. So think of it this way. If there is no potential for a mutually beneficial exchange that leaves parties in a place that is better off than not negotiating, then the matter should not be negotiated. Moving on to approaches in negotiations, have has anybody here, again, please put it in the Q&A. Can you tell me if there are different approaches in negotiations and what they are? Something you've heard about, read about, heard from somebody, come across in your previous sessions, lectures, and so on. Are there different approaches in negotiations? What are they? I'm just going to look at the Q&A again.
Can you give us an example of what might be an approach? It seems based on the comments from students, some are not sure what could be a possible answer option here.
Yeah. Chow Feng, good. Integrated negotiation. Debases. I hope I've pronounced your name right. I apologize if I haven't. Integrative, distributive. Very good. Passive approaches. Yes, that's a good way to look at it. Yes, thank you for your answers again. So I'm going to move on. So yes, there are different approaches. I'm going to take you through the two main, right? Distributive and integrative. Many of you would have heard of this. And please, you can feel free to read these definitions on the screen. I'm going to give you a few minutes to read this, to read what distributive negotiations is about.
Somebody said interest-based.
So I'll move on to the next slide where I have a few more points in bullet form. So from what you've read, it would be right to say that distributive negotiation approach is more oriented towards a win-lose outcome. Here, the seller's goal is to get the highest price possible, and the buyer's goal is to get the lowest price possible. And it is about walking away with the largest slice of the pie, right? And these negotiations are not based on parties' interests, and because they use power-based strategies during the interactions. You can say one person's loss is another person's gain. So it's a win-lose or lose-win situation. And also, parties do not know each other well and are not likely to work again in future. Moving on to integrative negotiations, I'm going to give you a few minutes to read this on this slide. And I'll move on to the next slide where you have some points. I see some hands raised. Who want to, okay, so I'm just going in order of what I see. Antonis, do you want to ask me your question or say something?
Antonius is one of our professors, so I'm not sure if he wanted to add something. But yes, Antonius, if you would like to contribute, yes, please go ahead.
No, hi, Vas. I think that was a mistake. I'm trying to find a way to see the chat or the Q&A. I don't see anything. I don't know why, but I don't want to interrupt the lecture, so apologies.
No problem. So,
Sorry, Cheryl.
Mahmoud, no problem at all. So, Mahmoud, did you want to say anything? or Thanapol, Chao Feng. I see these. Mohammed Sadiq. Okay, so I'm just going to continue.
Yes, please.
So
Yes.
moving on to integrative negotiations, basically, it's more oriented towards a win-win outcome. It's just the opposite of distributive negotiations, and here parties perceive their goals to be compatible with one another. So parties basically they cooperate. There's more cooperation here to achieve the maximum by integrating their interests into an agreement. As a result, they use collaborative and problem-solving strategies. And you can say integrative approaches involve compromise, trust, and far-sightedness. You can say, basically also studies show that behaviors that hurt negotiators are not integrative in nature. So studies by Neal and Baseman and Puri, they have stated this. And in the case of integrative negotiations, both parties are trying to make the pie bigger. So, and here also more or less parties know each other and they're likely to negotiate again. So, in a nutshell, this is the difference between integrative negotiations and distributive negotiations. And you can say that behaviors associated with the distributive approaches are basically arguments and debates and sort of extreme demands, grudges, unwillingness to listen, and other sort of contentious tactics. And that's why it's also called positional bargaining. And those behaviors associated with the integrative approaches are open sharing of information, willingness to listen, trade offs of valued interests, and basically an interest based discussion. So, which is why it's called interest based negotiations. So, let's move on. And I want to understand from all of you, what can you tell me and what is the difference between a successful and unsuccessful negotiation? I'm going to look at the chat. I'm sorry, the Q&A again.
That's a very interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah, for those who are answering, if you cannot see the chat box, please use a Q&A. However, both the options are enabled for everyone to interact with us.
So win-win situations equal successful negotiations. That's an interesting way to look at it. Okay, there's no right or wrong answer here, so please feel free to share. We can all learn from each other.
Well, if as a result of the negotiations my position has improved, then I suppose that was a successful negotiation.
Thanks, Vas. So integrative negotiation is the best option. Okay, I have an exercise and that you can do in the coming slides, and let's see. Let's put that to test. Participant, thank you so much for sharing. I see a lot of comments. Thank you so much for being such an engaging audience. So I will move on to the next slide here. So negotiations is an attractive conflict management tool, and parties who have had a friendly past are more likely to reach successful outcomes than parties that have had at least one dispute. That's what Gosen says. And so what makes negotiation successful? I have a list here. But there again, is successful negotiation subjective? So I'm going to give you an example for you to think about. If Team A enters the negotiations expecting to get 70% of the pie, but they get only 65%, and if Team B enters the negotiations expecting to get 30%, but they manage to achieve 35%, then Team A might consider the negotiations to be a partial failure, whereas Team B might consider the negotiations as a success. However, an outside observer, unless sufficiently armed with information, of course, concerning the target and resistance points, they would probably have a very different assessment concerning the end result of the negotiations. Does that make sense? So both are logical viewpoints, and you can see from this example that the concepts of success and failure are strictly self-imposed. However, studies have stated that the ability for negotiators to come to the table to negotiate again that can be termed as a successful negotiation.
That's a good one. Based on the percentages only, expectations versus actual outcomes, it almost looks like the way to win in any negotiations is to set low targets,
Yes.
right?
So now, because I see some of you have written in the chat that the best way to negotiate is integrative, I have an exercise for you in this slide. I want to know what your negotiation approach would be and the reason for your choice. So the first one is when you say you're traveling to Turkey on vacation, you're buying a rug from a vendor, and there are many vendors around. So what would be your negotiation approach? Integrative or distributive? I'm just going to look at the chat again.
Cheryl, can you explain one more time the difference between integrative and distributive? Like, what are the exact differences or attributes of one versus the other?
Okay, so distributive negotiations here, the seller's goal is to get the highest price possible. Buyer's goal is to get the lowest price possible. It basically, you can say one person's loss is another person's gain. Integrative is more oriented towards win-win outcome. Here, they're trying to integrate their interests into an agreement. So basically, both parties are trying to make the pie bigger. Did that answer?
Can any negotiation be turned into an integrative type of negotiation, or sometimes it's always distributive? Like if I'm trying to buy a car, the more I pay, the more I lose, and the other way around. So can this one still be integrative, or sometimes it's only distributive?
That's a good question. So let's say you are trying to buy a car and you really want that car, and that's the only dealer there that has this new model of the car, then you're probably going to try to want to interact with him again. So in such cases, it would be wise to use an integrative approach. But let's say if you're buying a car that is not necessarily a new model, you can find that across the state, or anywhere, it's just available and there are dealers across the state selling it. You know that if the dealer does not give you a good price, you can walk away. There's no motivation for you to stand and be, sort of use an integrative approach, because you're not necessarily looking to collaborate with this person again because you're looking to walk away and find a better deal. I hope I answered your question.
Yes. So when we make or are trying to make the negotiations integrative, does it mean that we are trying to compromise, or are we trying to enlarge the pie, so to speak, or how can we turn a confrontational sort of distributive type of negotiations into integrative? Or sometimes it's not even feasible to try to turn it into integrative.
Yes, I think sometimes it may not be feasible because you may just want to walk away from the situation. It's some, like for example, let's take these examples on the screen. Buying a rug from a vendor. There are about 10 vendors in the same, location, let's say, and all selling the same rugs. The approach would be to walk away if your expectations are not met, and that would be a more of a distributive style of negotiating. And
Yep.
driving from an instructor, it's an ongoing rapport you're trying to build because, well, I'm still new to the US, so in the UK it's up to your driving instructor to help you pass the exam. So here I think it's a little different. I'm not completely sure how it works, but I don't think it's up to the driving instructor. And there in the UK, it's also important for you it's preferred if you go to the exam in the instructor's car, where they have the board to say that you've learned driving from this person. But here I think it's not really preferred. It just depends on the person. So, if you need to borrow the car from the person, you need the instructor to be present for the exam, you're dependent on the instructor to pass your exam, I think it would be wise to collaborate with them, which would be integrative approaches, even though you don't really agree with everything they say. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, yes. I was thinking like, for example, if I'm trying to buy a car and I'm trying to get the best possible price, it almost seems like every extra dollar I pay, that's my loss, but every extra dollar the dealer reduces the price by, that's his loss. But I wonder if we can still make it integrative by, I don't know, enlarging the pie and adding more options to the table.
Yes,
Like maybe I'll
that's right.
get the car cheaper, but I'll pay for extended warranty, or maybe
Yes.
I'll buy the car cheaper, but I'll finance it, and the dealer will make some money on I don't know, on the interest on the financing, or some other way,
Yeah.
so that in the end we can still all win.
Yes, that's right. I mean, in such a situation, it's called log rolling. So I'm going to take you through that and help you understand what that means towards the end of this session. I'll 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 kind of provide an overview of some key concepts, and log rolling is included.
Sounds very good.
Okay, so moving on, conflict management styles, and we all have different conflict management styles, right? So basically, negotiation is an attractive conflict management tool. Conflict is inevitable. It's an inevitable part of negotiations. It could occur when people have different goals, of course, different values, and they're trying to bring this all to the negotiations table. And there are 5 main conflict management styles, as you can see on this slide. I have them here again, 5 conflict management styles. And these styles basically project an overall picture of the individual's communication style and their orientation towards conflict. You can say the latter is influenced by a combination of their personalities and background, be it cultural or, their experiences and so on. So let's move on to the first. It's accommodate. I lose, you win. You can read that on the screen. So basically, it's about giving into the wishes and demands of the other person. It's basically just the opposite of what competitive negotiators do, meaning, accommodative person, they tend to have low concern for themselves and high concern for others. They adopt this way of negotiating to preserve the harmony, to avoid disrupting the relationship, you can say, with the other party. And when do you use it? Let's say you and your company are at fault and you want to sort of bandage the relationship with the other party. You want to rebuild the relationship because you're in a weaker position and the relationship with the other person is very critical. So however, there are also dangers in using this because this can be seen as a sign of weakness by sometimes competitive negotiators, and your counterpart may also see you as having very little to offer because you're relying on basically you're relying on the other person's generosity. It's like gambling, right? So you can come across as creating high expectations for the other party who think that they have more coming their way. And also for the other party, it can be seen as Greek gifting, where Greek gifting is about luring into reciprocation, obliging you to give something of higher value back. So it can be seen that way. So that's accommodative style. So moving on to compete, it's I win, you lose. So basically, competitive negotiators pursue their own needs. They have high concern for their own needs, low concern for the needs of others. They're also narrowly focused on short-term goals, and they tend to be assertive, uncooperative, and sort of dominating in their style of negotiation. So when can you use it? You want quick results? Basically you're trying to buy and or sell something as a one-off, so when something is not negotiable and, like for example, compliance is required and, that sort of situation. The danger of using it is it can lead to deadlock situations in negotiations, resulting in somebody walking out. It can lead to not contributing of anything of value, zero value, and leads to sort of withholding worthwhile ideas. And all this can basically curb your competition in the market. Moving on to avoid. I lose, you lose. So this is basically, it's often referred to as passive aggressive trait in negotiations, and people with this trait dislike conflict. Sometimes even I avoid conflict, sometimes it's rather than talking with the person, this can be a little bit, careful. You have to be careful with it because sometimes people who avoid conflict, they could take revenge without you even knowing it, and it's just the personality that comes along with conflict avoidance. So when you use it, when the time invested in the negotiations outweighs the benefits, and when there's a lot of emotions involved, it's pointless to go on hammering. So wait for people to calm down first, have your emotions in check. And you can also avoid conflict when you're sort of dragged into a negotiations unprepared. So, this is the best strategy to avoid the negotiations. The danger of using this, however, is the person with the greater urgency will eventually suffer the bad effects of the situation. And, also when communication is cut off, you leave the other party to fill in the blanks. And this can lead to assumptions and maybe sometimes escalations. And it can also create mutual resentment between parties, leading to sort of frosty interpersonal relationships. Compromise. I win, lose some, you win, lose some. So here, you know, everybody gives up a little bit of what they want, but nobody gets everything they want. The person using this style of negotiation takes a sort of a middle ground position. Parties are assertive and cooperative at the same time, but to a lesser extent than in collaborative negotiations. And sometimes compromising can lead to haggling. So when do you use it really? Let's say you're pushed for time. Let's say you're dealing with somebody you trust. There's reduced strain on the relationship there. So that's sort of a situation. You also tend to compromise when you're in a little bit of a lousy situation with nothing to offer and you just want to seal the deal. You know, the danger, however, of using this strategy is it can be seen as an excuse for not preparing properly. It can again come across as like you're a weak negotiator for the other party. And if your counterpart knows this about you, it may lead to bigger opening positions followed by, greater chances of deadlock situations. So, you're compromising a lot and then you lead to a deadlock situation. So the last one that a lot of you are familiar with is collaborate. I win, you win, right? We spoke about this type of negotiation. So here parties are both cooperative. They're both assertive at the same time. Contributions here are made with the possibility of co-creating a shared solution that everyone can support. And when do you use it? When you want to reach an equitable and fair agreement. It is a sort of a constructive and interest-based negotiations here that allows for parties to really understand what the interests are of the other party, the objectives of the other party. And this is definitely beneficial for both parties and can lead to a win-win outcome. However, the danger of using this sometimes you could be perceived as a weak negotiator, and sometimes, highly competitive negotiators could try to use manipulative tactics when they perceive you as a weak negotiator. So,
Cheryl, can I ask you a few questions about these
yes,
types? So
yes.
one, do studies show which of these leads to best outcome for the negotiator? So are those who are willing to compromise, do they usually end up with better deals than those who are not willing to compromise? And also, do we know what roughly is the distribution, sort of percentage of negotiators in the population in each category? Maybe I can even ask people, which type do you think you usually use in negotiations? Like, I'm willing to think that I'm collaborating, but I'm not sure. I don't. How about you, Cheryl? What's your style?
I realized, after, reflective, that sometimes it depends on the situation. I tend to avoid. I have accommodated. I don't necessarily see myself as a competitive negotiator, though I think it's important for me to learn that negotiation style. I've compromised, yes. Depending on the situation, I've done a lot of this, but I think I'm still learning to become, sort of learning to be a more assertive and
But
push back a little bit. And I think it's important
But would that be beneficial to you? So it seems like many people aspire to be tougher negotiators, but will that lead to better outcomes for them?
So
I don't know,
if
maybe
you're,
it will. Yes.
yeah. So if you're in a room where there are really, there are highly competitive negotiators, when you're in a room where there are people who are being uncooperative, you need to push back a little bit. I think in those cases, when you're in the room where people are just pursuing their own needs, I think it is important to push back and, be a competitive negotiator.
I see most of the students put in the comments that they are collaborative negotiators. How about you, Yukta? Do you collaborate, avoid, compromise, negotiate, compete? What are the other? I think I've listed all of them.
I think preferably I believe that collaborative approach helps the other person and you as well. And I've tried to do that most of the times, but I think I'd like to understand from both of you. Usually, when you are on a sales call or you're trying to close a client, so in that, you know that you have to be competitive, or sometimes you have to have that yes objective. So, what is the best negotiations approach for that, according to both of you?
Mhm. And I wonder if it also matters, like I assume if it's a competitive strategy, if both are competitive, that's probably not very good, right? So it may be that maybe it's the combination that gives you the best result, not your own style.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, a combination is definitely good. It's better to assess the situation and accordingly take on that approach to negotiate.
Yeah.
So I have background factors. We are time. I mean, I think we have 3 minutes. Is it okay if I continue?
Yes, please go on. So we must stop at 11 because another meeting
Okay.
starts then, but we still have 20 minutes.
Okay. All right.
Please.
Okay. So now I'm introducing you to the variables that can influence negotiation outcomes. So we have background factors here. We have stages of negotiation and atmosphere. And many of you may have, some of this may be familiar to some of you. So background factors basically include the objectives, the environment, the market position, third parties influence, and negotiators. Each of this play a role in negotiations, and these basically are, let's say, objectives. Objectives are different interests that each party achieves successfully for their business. They could be, as you may know, common, conflicting, complementary in nature. And when these objectives are common and complementary, both parties are comfortable to proceed with the negotiations because it's beneficial to both the parties. On the other hand, when it's conflicting in nature, it can have a negative influence in the negotiation process. And because you know, people know that it's mostly going to lead to an unsuccessful outcome. The environment basically could be your social, political, market structural factors that could hinder the environment, of both parties independently. The social and political factors influence the process of negotiations, while the market structure factors influence the atmosphere within the negotiations. For instance, the number of buyers and sellers in the market determine the alternatives available to both the parties, and this in turn sort of adds pressure to the parties involved in the negotiations. Third parties are consultants, subcontractors, or the government, and this can influence the negotiations too, because all of these objectives, their objectives are all different. And as a result, there could be problems relating to foreign exchange, infrastructure, sort of employment options, and so on. Then moving on to negotiators involved in this process, they come with different skill sets, right? Different levels of experience. For example, a negotiator with a technical background will focus more on the technical details and pay less attention to sort of terms of payment. And, a negotiator with a business background will focus more on, latter type of issues than technical details. So this is what background factors are about. And stages of negotiation, it's another process that influences the negotiation. It's another factor that influences the negotiation process. So here there are three stages. The pre-negotiation stage is basically the parties or groups that are interested in doing the business with one another. They contact each other and they make tentative offers. And this is an important stage compared to the formal negotiation stage because at this stage, you're assessing the benefits of entering into a potential negotiations with the other party. So you're gathering information about the other party's background, their operating environment, their infrastructural abilities, their their competitors, their all these kind of things. And you kind of take precautionary measures. And in some countries, it's worth noting that, they issue a letter of acceptance or intent at this stage. So in the West, basically, this is broadly referred to as the grant of contract, and it merely indicates the desire for the party to negotiate further. Moving on to face negotiations, which everybody, talks about and knows about, it's different, here during this stage, as different expectations continue to exist between the parties, right? Because they all come from different backgrounds, it makes the face-to-face negotiation process complex. Differences in each party's cultures, traditions, they're brought to surface, and it's basically difficult to understand, right? Here at this stage, when they're trying to negotiate face to face, no party wants to submit any final offer. They just wait. Post negotiations, this could result in a final contract being drawn up and signed sort of with when the terms of agreements have been agreed upon. And so, in order to avoid a renewed face to face negotiations, which sometimes could happen, you're meeting again to have a face to face negotiations, it is perhaps best practice to maintain minutes at every stage of the negotiations. That way, you know that all parties are on the same page and they have the same understanding of the decision and exchanges and so on. All right, we move on to atmosphere. Here, atmosphere, it can be defined as the social environment in which the parties interact with each other and how the parties regard each other's behavior. Here, at this stage of the negotiation, parties are looking for mutual solutions to problems, and during this time, the characteristics of the atmosphere, such as conflict, cooperation, power dependence, and expectations, they take control. So, what is conflict cooperation? They're vital characteristics depicted in a negotiation process, and the degree of these depend on the objectives put forth by the parties and the way the parties manage them. The power dependence characteristic is closely related to the actual power that either party brings to the negotiations. In other words, if one party has alternatives and opportunities in the marketplace, basically it will indirectly have an influence on the negotiations, right? So they would have the ability to control the negotiations to their favor. However, if both parties have equal power, which is rarely the case in negotiations, then you can say the negotiations is in balance, but in negotiations there's mostly always a buyer and a seller. The last characteristic is expectations. And these are of two types, of course, long-term and short-term. Long-term expectations take into account future business prospects for both parties. And if these are stronger, the parties will be willing to negotiate further to come to a mutual agreement. On the other hand, if short-term agreements are basically when the parties decide they do not see a future and they move on from one stage of the negotiations to the next stage because they just want to obtain a good outcome at each stage. So it's short-lived. So this is how I would define, the characteristics with an atmosphere. So let's move on to some key concepts in business negotiations. So many of you must have heard these terms.
That's interesting.
So BATNA. So here basically the best course of action, it's the best course of action a party can take if the negotiation situation reaches an impasse. And this is in the famous book by Fisher, Urey, and Patton, Getting to Yes, right? So, in other words, a BATNA is an alternative that a party will select if they walk away from the negotiations because an agreement cannot be reached with a counterpart and they want to move on to somebody who has a better deal.
So if I'm negotiating about that car with the car dealer, I don't like the price, my best alternative is I basically keep the money in my pocket and just go to another dealer.
Yes,
Unless there is
right.
no other dealer in the town,
Yes.
in which case then without the wheels.
Yes, that's right. Then you convert from distributive to integrative, and then you come back to, build a rapport with the person. Yes, so reservation price. So Here, it is the point beyond which a negotiator is willing to walk away from a negotiated agreement. So when negotiations involve money, it is essential to know your reservation price, sorry. For a seller, this is the lowest amount they're willing to accept, and for a buyer, it is the highest they're willing to pay. So when I complete BATNA, reservation price, and ZOPA, I'll give you an example so that you understand this better. ZOPA, Zone of Possible Agreement. It's the bargaining range between each party's reservation prices. That is the zone within which an agreement can be made by both the parties. So outside this zone, no amount of negotiations will yield an agreement. Okay, so let's take a car. Let's say if you're selling your car for $50,000, your reservation price is set at $40,000. That is your seller's worst case price, right? For the buyer, the maximum he is willing to pay is $45,000. That is the buyer's reservation price. And his desired price is $30,000. I'm sorry, a little bit for you to write down, to do the math.
So we need to give you the ZOPA?
Yes, the ZOPA, yes. I'm going to check
Okay,
in the
Yukta,
Q&A.
what is ZOPA in this case? Did you do the math? I think I have my answer.
I think I do, but
Is it 40 to 45? Did I get that right?
So
40,
I'll say this.
40
Yes,
to
that's right.
45?
Yes, that's right. The bargaining range of the ZOPA is 5,000.
I demand a gold star. Yeah, I see
Yeah.
some students put that in comments, so yes.
That's great. Good job, everybody. Thank you again for being such an engaging audience. So that's right. So you got that right. So that's your ZOPA. Now I'm going to introduce you to some more concepts. Anchoring. I don't know how many of you have heard of it, but it is the idea of establishing the focus of discussion around a certain point, which can be a figure, it can be an issue, it can be a price, it could be anything of that sort. It is sometimes a tactic adopted by negotiators to fix the bargaining range around this point, which typically favors the person who anchors. All right? Value creation. So here, value creating negotiations allow parties to integrate various sources of value through trade-offs to basically enlarge the pie. This can be achieved through integrative or interest-based approaches. This means you brainstorm to increase the resources bargained for. For example, you're going to buy a mobile, you're going to buy a phone, right? A new phone, and the retailer may not reduce the price, but they may negotiate with you to basically throw in voicemail or a better package, that you're happy with. This way, it is a win-win for both of you. So that way you're adding value. Now, log rolling. So this is, something that we, kind of touched based on in the previous slides. So if some issues are in dispute, negotiators should be willing to do some trade-offs. If you're negotiating, you should be willing to do some trade-offs. So for instance, if one side values something more than the other, that's your priority, you value something more than the other, then that should be given in exchange for reciprocity on issues that are of a higher priority to the opponent. So for this strategy to be used, the negotiator should know his or her own priorities well, and also the priorities or preferences of the other person. For instance, if a partial impasse occurs, of course, opportunities can be missed and value resources can be squandered. And in this case, log rolling can be effective. It is an effective strategy where trade-offs are made across issues based on an understanding of each other's preferences. So basically, that's how you look at it. So I know that there's a lot of information that I shared with you. I hope you carry this with you and you found this session really helpful. Before I conclude and provide you a recap of what we covered, remember that the process of negotiations is complex and one theory or framework cannot embrace all aspects of negotiations. Moreover, you can say it's multidimensional in nature because it's studied from different disciplines, right? Psychology, organizational behavior, decision sciences, marketing, economics, international relations, and so on. And
Yeah, politics.
also, yeah, yeah, and also while the concepts of integrative and distributive bargaining are clear in theory, in practice they often overlap, in the examples we've exchanged. So, like I said before, this session is not to make you a professional negotiator, but it can help you gain insight into how to deal with conflict and basically exposes you to, how to deal with challenging situations that can take place in a group setting. So, to summarize,
Maybe Cheryl, while we have a couple more minutes, so can
yeah,
you repeat the types of the books that you would recommend on the topic? So Get Into Yes by Yuri. So that's a classic. Anything else
yeah.
that students might want to
So,
look at?
that's a good thing. So I recommend a lot of articles so I can, so Getting to Yes, Negotiating Agreement Without Giving In, book by Fisher, Urey, and Patton. Yes.
Uh-huh.
Then I have articles, so I can mention authors, scholars who are in this area basically. For example, Carnival and Pree, they have this article called Negotiation and Mediation. It's in the Annual Review of Psychology. Then we have Donahue, who analyzes negotiation tactics. The paper is Analyzing Negotiation Tactics, Development of a Negotiation Interact System. That's in Human Communication Research. Then,
Maybe we'll compile a list with full references and share it with all of the students in case they want to look up more on the topic, because this is
yeah,
a fascinating, important topic.
yes,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay.
So, yes, so basically, to summarize, successful negotiations hinge on preparation, clear communication, and the willingness to collaborate. And as you move forward, think about how you can implement these strategies in your own groups. So that's it from my end. Thank you again for being such an attentive and engaging audience today.